Unlike many of her contemporaries in Hollywood who changed their names to something more memorable and glamorous, the woman who'd personify the thrilling modernity and feverish energy of the Jazz Age was born with the name that would become famous around the world. Clara Bow, short, sweet, and unique, it suited the original It girl perfectly. Clara's fame is among the most enduring from the silent era. Most people today have never seen a single one of her movies, but when you think of a 1920s star, she immediately comes to mind, most likely pouting or winking at the camera. Her legacy continues to this day. Her image has become iconic, and only recently a Clara film called The Pill Pounder, thought to be lost, was rediscovered in perfect condition at a parking lot auction in Omaha. Hollywood utilized Clara's immensely charismatic talent by making her a symbol for her age. The empowered, independent, and scandalous flapper. She's outspoken, fun-loving, and doesn't need a man, although she can easily get one, and usually many more besides. She's the life of every party. Her clothes are effortlessly stylish and modern. In a word, she has it, that certain kind of sex appeal that can't be defined by any other word, and that we are still desperate to possess today. But the woman behind the image, the real Clara Bow, was very different. For many years the public was unaware of the true misery of her origins and the tragedies that littered her path to stardom. Even when she candidly spoke about her youth, it was a romanticized version of it. The long-term effects of her childhood could not be suppressed forever and would come back to haunt her later years. For decades, scandalous stories about her were more accessible to the public than her films, and her image was tarnished by numerous lies. In this video, I hope to do justice to the incredible talent that was Clara Bow. On the 29th of July 1905, Clara was born in a cramped and dingy room above an equally dilapidated Baptist church in Prospect Heights, Brooklyn. She was the third child of Sarah Gordon Bow and Robert Bow, who were second-generation immigrants of English, Scottish, and Irish descent. Sarah had been informed by a doctor that this third birth was likely to kill both mother and child. Both of Clara's parents had been born into poverty in the slums of Brooklyn and grew up only a block away from each other. Her father had lost his own mother at age 2 and grew up to be a drunk and a womanizer who saw women as objects there for him to use and abuse. Sarah, meanwhile, lived with an extremely abusive father and an emotionally unstable mother, and was so desperate to escape her family, she fell pregnant even before she married Robert in late 1903. She did not love him, nor did she want children. Their first child died 2 days after being born, and Sarah disposed of the nameless baby in the rubbish. The second child's birth was witnessed by a doctor, and so was named Emily and buried in a mass grave when she too succumbed to the high infant mortality rates that made the sight of stacked-up children's coffins a part of everyday life in the Brooklyn tenements. Clara would romanticize her parents' origins when she wrote a series of articles on her rise to fame in 1928. "My mother was a very beautiful woman," Clara said. "She came from a good family in New York State, and her mother was French and her father was Scottish. They lived on a country place a few hours from New York City. I was never there because it was gone before I was born, but from what my mother told me, it must have been quiet and beautiful and prosperous. Perhaps that was the reason that my mother didn't want to marry. She idolized her father and loved the home where she'd been born and brought up, and that was all she wanted from life. Marriage frightened her. She felt no need for anything more in her life than her father and mother and the quiet life she led in the country." Clara would go on to say that her father lived in a neighbouring farm and came from good stock back in England. It seems Clara created these origins from a couple of facts about her parents. They had been neighbours, and Sarah did stay in the country when she was 16, after falling headfirst out of a second-story window, which injured her so badly she went to her uncle's farm in Richmond to heal. This blissful time spent in the country was probably the happiest time of her life, and so when she begrudgingly returned to Brooklyn, it was not to a beautiful and loving home. Sarah's father Frederick had lost his job and descended further into alcoholism. He took out his anger on his wife, who after so many years of physical abuse had lost her mind completely. Madness was the most shameful thing to have in a family in those days, and Frederick kept his wife hidden as much as possible. During Sarah's pregnancy with Clara, with the news that his nagging wife would soon be dead, Robert Bow abandoned her, forcing her to return to her parents. Sarah's mother was the only person to help her give birth during a 115-degree heat wave that had raised the infant mortality rate to an estimated 80%. Clara said of her birth, I don't suppose two people ever looked death in the face more clearly than my mother and I the morning I was born. At first, Clara did not move or make a sound, and was presumed dead until her grandmother shook her and she let out a small cry. Soon enough, Robert received news his wife and child had survived, and returned to name Clara after his sister. When she had achieved fame, Clara would remember of her entry into the world. No one wanted me to be born in the first place. Everything was against my coming here at all. Everything was against my staying here. There have been a great many times when I wish they hadn't fought quite so hard to keep me here, but I don't feel that way anymore. The Bow family moved back into the tenements, where multiple households shared an overflowing toilet and were crammed into disease-ridden rooms often bereft of windows. Diseases spread like wildfire in these next to unlivable conditions, and often actual fires broke out too. Rats scurried around the trash and human waste thrown out of the windows, and it is a miracle Clara survived. Her early childhood did have one ray of light, however. Her maternal grandfather Frederick moved in with Sarah and Robert after committing his wife to an asylum shortly after Clara's birth. A year after being committed, she would die in the asylum. Despite his extreme abuse of his own wife and daughter, Frederick adored and doted on Clara. He made her a swing and was pushing her on it when he collapsed in a sudden fit. When he died the following day, Clara lost the only person in the world who cared about her. She was only 3 years old. She said, "The first night as he lay in his coffin in the dining room, I crept out of my bed and lay down on the floor beside him, because I had a feeling he might be lonely. My father found me there in the morning, almost frozen. I said, 'Hush, you mustn't wake grandfather, he's sleeping.' But I knew he was dead, and I missed him very much." Soon Clara began to feel just how unloved she was. Her parents couldn't have been worse suited to each other, and frequently fought. Sarah loathed her husband and derided any ambitions he had. Clara recalled in 1928, "I do not think my mother ever loved my father. He knew it, and it made him very unhappy, for he worshipped her always. His devotion to her, his unfailing gentleness and kindness, all through the years of her illness, is like a miracle to me." In reality, Robert took his frustration out on Clara and would beat her mercilessly for the slightest disobedience, usually when she hadn't even done anything. Robert Bow abandoned the family regularly, sometimes for long periods, and after the death of her father, Sarah had no one else to turn to or depend on in the absence of her husband, and so she sold her body in order to survive. Each night she left 4-year-old Clara alone in the cramped room they lived in, and would return with a man who was introduced to Clara as an uncle. Every night there was a new stranger, and when Clara was mocked at school, she boasted that she had a bigger family and more uncles than any of her bullies. She would only piece together the humiliating truth years later, but at the time, whenever an uncle arrived, Clara was shoved in a tiny closet and locked in with the stern instructions to not make a sound. Vermin scurried around her in the darkness, and she covered her ears and shut her eyes tight in order to block out the strange noises she heard coming from the bedroom. She was always happy when this ordeal was over, however, because she and her mother could afford to eat well. When Clara was still quite young, Sarah fell down a flight of stairs and reopened the head injury she had sustained at 16. After this second fall, Sarah began to have mysterious seizures that could strike out of nowhere and leave her in a catatonic state, sometimes for extended periods of time. Clara said she had always been subject to fainting spells, and they grew gradually worse. They weren't fits and they weren't regular fainting spells. Often they would happen 2 or 3 times a day, and then maybe she would be free from them for a long time. When she felt them coming on, she would look at me so pathetically, like a woman caught in some trap. Then her eyes would grow glassy and she would start to gasp for breath. It was just as though she were being strangled. Prior to these fits, Sarah would become extremely aggressive and overly moralistic. She threatened Clara, who later said, "She idolized me, but with a strange, bitter love, almost as though she were afraid to love me for fear I too would be snatched away from her." Clara told herself her mother's coldness towards her was due to the fact that Sarah must have noble blood. Clara idolized her mother, even when Sarah told her she wished Clara was dead. "I loved her terribly," said Clara. "She was tall and slim and carried herself like a princess, so I think it must be true that she had good blood in her." At school, Clara had few friends and was bullied for her ragged appearance and stutter. Her hair was cut short and her clothes were made from her mother's worn-out ones. She did surprisingly well academically, although her cripplingly low self-esteem made Clara think she was both ugly and stupid. But nevertheless, she learned to stand up for herself, and soon she gained a reputation for even being able to win fights against boys. She fiercely defended her younger friend and neighbour Johnny from bullies, and treated him like a little brother. Perhaps it was comforting for Clara to give another child the protection and love she herself lacked. Then a harrowing tragedy occurred that Clara herself describes best. I was alone in our house upstairs when I heard a terrible noise downstairs. Johnny had gone too near the fire and his clothes had caught and were burning, and he was screaming with pain and fright. Clara rolled Johnny up in a carpet and ordered his hysterical mother to call a doctor, but by the time the doctor arrived, there was nothing he could do. Clara said, "The little fellow died in my arms. The last thing he said was 'Clara, Clara.' When I knew he was dead, I went upstairs and cried for hours. It seemed to me that life was just too terrible to be born." For months afterwards, Clara's dreams were haunted by the memory of Johnny calling her name. She said later, "Things like that are terrible for a little child to go through. I was only about 8 or 9, I guess." Years later, when Clara wanted to cry on camera, she asked the orchestra band on set to play Rockabye Baby, which some thought a peculiar choice. Clara explained that the song never failed to bring tears to her eyes, because it was the song Johnny's mother sang him to sleep with. Throughout her childhood, Clara rarely stayed in one place for long, although her homes were almost always in the Prospect Heights area. She moved schools and found it hard to make friends, especially with girls. Her tomboy appearance and attitude earned her the friendship of the local boys, however. Clara remembered, "We used to skate together and play baseball and all sorts of rough games in the street, and I never felt there was a difference between us." In 1918, the Spanish flu swept through the tenements at an alarming rate, claiming an estimated 4,500 lives a week. That pace of death was kept up for 6 months, and the Bows moved to the opposite end of Brooklyn, a short walk away from Coney Island. 1918 was a time of comparative happiness in Clara's childhood. Away from the diseased tenements, Sarah's condition began to improve. For a long time she had been bedridden, and Clara had taken over the housework as well as becoming her mother's nursemaid and confidant, and it had not been a pleasant experience. Sarah manipulated her daughter and put all of her own bitterness onto Clara. The central point Sarah conveyed to Clara was that men were never to be trusted, much less depended on. You had to get power over them any way you could. All they wanted to do was hurt women. Falling in love put you in a position of weakness. This wasn't helpful advice to someone as affection-starved and desperate for security, love and stability as Clara. However, after the move provided better air quality, living conditions, and a job for Robert Bow as a busboy on Coney Island, Sarah's attitude towards Clara became almost maternal. She helped style her daughter's hair and made her a new dress that showed the tomboy was quite feminine after all. Clara's new appearance resulted in the loss of her male friends after one of them kissed her. Clara was sad to be growing up, as it meant the friends she had as a tomboy would never treat her the same way again. Despite her mother's improvement, Clara's home life was still fraught, and she could not forget the many traumas she had suffered, so she found a new form of escapism. "I had just one place where I could go and forget the misery and gloom of home," said Clara. "That was the motion pictures. I can never repay them what they gave me." Clara saw as many films as she could and devoured movie magazines, dreaming she would one day be in their pages. Her entire generation had been convinced that fame was the answer to all your problems, and the endless love of the audience would make up for any hurt you could possess. For those like Clara who had never seen much good in the world, a life of happiness, adventure and romance opened up before their very eyes. "I worshipped Mary Pickford," Clara said. "How kind and gentle and loving she was. Maybe there were people like that in the world." Clara began to secretly imitate her favourite stars in the mirror. She later reminisced, "A great ambition began to unfold in me. I kept it hidden for fear of being laughed at. I felt myself how ridiculous it was. Why, I wasn't even pretty. I was a square, awkward, funny-faced kid. But all the same, I knew I wanted to be a motion picture actress. And I can say one thing right here. If I have had success beyond my own greatest dreams, it may be that it is the reward for the purity of my motive when I first dreamed that dream. For truly, I didn't think of fame or money or anything like that. I just thought of how beautiful it all was and how wonderful it must be to do for people what pictures were doing." How revealing it is that far from dreaming of the wealth or praise fame brings, it was joy and comfort Clara wanted to give to others, as the stars she worshipped had given to her. She certainly succeeded at bringing hope and happiness into the lives of those sorely in need of it. Her comedic timing is superb, Her natural, fluid facial expressions and the depth she brings to a performance make her stand out in the melodramatic silent era. Her acting has aged incredibly well, and there's something infectious about her joyful roles. When Clara's having fun, you want to have fun right along with her. When she's laughing, you can't help but break into a smile. In the endearing innocence of Clara's dream, something else is revealed, an understandable naivety when it comes to the realities of the industry. Long hours, hard work, and exacting contracts were a big part of what it meant to be a star, but those difficulties paled in comparison to the peculiarity of fame itself. The kind of fame early stars such as Mary Pickford had is still unrivaled today. Before the movies, artists, authors, and performers were the biggest celebrities, but a famous novelist or a master painter could walk down the street of their own city unnoticed. The most famous opera singer in the country might attract crowds in places they'd never visited before on merit of their fame alone, but their stardom was limited to the number of seats in the theatre, and once the performance was over, it was over. But with the movies, a star could perform in thousands of cinemas all day every day, and their face would be recognised in countries they hadn't even heard of. Some American actors received tens of thousands of fan letters every month from all over the world, including parts of Asia and South America. There were many like Clara who saw the movies as a beautiful dreamland of glamour, excitement, and above all happy endings, and failed to differentiate between the finished product of a film and the process of making it. Clara's generation and she herself would learn the hard way that the world they were invited to inhabit for an hour in the movie theatre really was just a fantasy. Clara learned the hard way before her career even began. As they grew closer, Clara trusted her mother enough to share her dream of acting, but Sarah harshly scolded her, telling her she was too ugly and talentless to act. Sarah accused all actresses of being ladies of disrepute. She vowed she would never let her daughter sell herself that way, nor walk down the street in fancy clothes and thick makeup as actresses did. The stage had long been associated with immorality, and that stain on the profession had been inherited by the film industry. It didn't help Clara's case when her mother read about multiple high-profile scandals in Hollywood, further solidifying her loathing of the industry. Robert Bow encouraged his daughter, but it is likely he was looking for financial gain rather than simply supporting Clara's ambitions. In 1921, for the second year in a row, Brewster Publications held the Fame and Fortune contest in all of its magazines. The winner was promised a part in the movie, and last year's competition had been judged by Mary Pickford. This year, some of the biggest commercial artists would be the judges. Acting ability and personality would be judged equally with beauty, and so on a whim, Clara decided to enter despite her self-doubt, and her father gave her $1 to get the 2 photos necessary to enter. Clara hated the photos, but when she personally delivered them, the contest manager noted down that she was very pretty, and as the weeks went by, she failed to appear in the lists of girls who had not made it. Eventually, she was among the small group of finalists to have a screen test made. At one of the screen tests, the 10 remaining girls were instructed to walk into the shot, pick up a telephone, and act out a range of emotions. Clara remained in the corner while the 9 others fought to go first. As she observed them, she realised none were trying to act naturally, but rather imitating the style of another star. When Clara finally performed the tasks, she did them as she would do them herself, giving a believable quality to the brief emotions she displayed that shocked and impressed the judges. After the final tests, when only one other girl remained, Clara returned home to be confronted by her mother about where she had been. Sarah fainted when Clara told the truth, and after the terrified girl revived her, Sarah told her daughter she'd rather see her dead than in the movies, before succumbing to a catatonic seizure that brought Clara to tears. She vowed to end her dreams of acting, but 3 days later she was announced as the 1921 Fame and Fortune contest winner. Clara said later, "It was hard for me to believe. I kept thinking they'd changed their minds. They told me the judges had picked me because I was different and had a unique personality." Clara was taken to a photographer's studio in Greenwich Village, where the photos that would appear in the winner announcements were taken. The photo that was chosen for publication was not particularly striking, but the others where Clara's pose is more natural portray the depth of emotion behind her eyes that few photos of her do. Here is a 16-year-old girl who has known hardship and misery. There is a haunting beauty to these photos. Clara had barely a decent piece of clothing to her name, and so the funds set aside for the contest winner to travel to New York, which Clara of course did not need, were spent on buying her a simple outfit and cleaning up her appearance. For her first role in Beyond the Rainbow, Clara had to provide her own wardrobe. Her cousin lent her the money to buy clothes after her namesake aunt refused to help her, believing her acting career was disgracing the family. When Clara met the film's director, he exclaimed, "Don't tell me she won the beauty contest," which made Clara run out of the room sobbing. Her first day on set, she came out in dreadful makeup, as the other actresses had refused to help her put it on, but she made up for all these mishaps by crying perfectly on cue, which astounded the director. Clara had learned to ignore her mother's criticisms and threats, but shortly after Beyond the Rainbow wrapped, she awoke from a deep sleep one night to see her mother leaning over her with a butcher knife in hand. Just as Sarah put the knife to her daughter's neck, Clara managed to overpower her and escape the room, locking her mother inside until her father came home. Sarah fell into one of her spells and the next morning had no memory of the incident. For Clara, however, chronic insomnia would haunt her from that night onwards, and the image of her mother looming above her would disturb what sleep she got. Soon Beyond the Rainbow opened, and despite Clara's insistence that she didn't care about the opinions of her female classmates, she invited a few of her schoolgirl bullies to see the movie with her, in the hope they would be impressed. To her horror and humiliation, Clara had been entirely cut from the film. When she achieved fame, a version of the movie with Clara's scenes included would be re-released, with her receiving the highest billing. The news that Clara was not yet an actress on screen only made Sarah more determined to end her daughter's life before she actually appeared in a film, and so a few days after the movie's release, Clara was chased by her mother with a knife and thrown out of the house. For 2 days she wandered aimlessly around Coney Island in a disassociated haze before her father found her and took her back to the house. Robert Bow had decided to put Sarah in an asylum. Clara's budding career could bring in a good salary and couldn't be jeopardized, and besides, Robert's relationship with his wife had long since deteriorated, and far from Clara's claims of his kindness during Sarah's illness, he had no desire to care for his wife. Clara protested that her mother wasn't insane, and she refused to believe Sarah truly wanted to hurt her. For all her mother's faults, at least Sarah was physically present, while Clara knew her father could easily abandon her again. In the same week as the release of her first film, Clara had suffered 2 attempts on her life, and now Sarah was sent to the asylum her own mother had been locked away in 16 years ago. Clara was wrong. This time her father did not abandon her, he did something much worse. Clara now took on the role of a wife. Between going to every studio and agency she could, frantically looking for jobs, she cooked and cleaned and did her father's laundry. He repaid her efforts by assaulting her. Clara had endured many traumas, but being violated by her own father proved too much for her, and she suffered a breakdown of sorts. While she was able to function, her memories of this pivotal time in her career remained virtually non-existent for decades, until therapy brought back all the repressed horrors of her youth. Clara explained in 1928, "It isn't really strange if my memory's not good, if I'm not very definite about facts and dates. I've been trying all my life to forget, not to remember." She coped once again by romanticizing her father. She described him as so kind, he always understood. He was harassed and miserable and overworked, but he was kind and understanding always. Clara's next part was in a whaling drama set in the 19th century called Down to the Sea in Ships, and she was given significantly more to do as a rebellious tomboy named Dot. She filmed on location in New Bedford for 13 weeks, earning $35 a week. Audiences enjoyed the film, which included footage of real whaling, but the critics did not. The only part they praised highly was Clara's performance. When an exhausted Clara returned home, she immediately visited her mother in the asylum, and Sarah demanded Clara get her out. Despite Clara's begging, Robert refused, as did other relatives Clara asked to house Sarah. Eventually Sarah was released in October 1922, and having learned at least a small lesson, she held back on criticizing her daughter's career. Clara's next part was an uncredited extra role in Enemies of Women, where she danced on a table and was the picture of happiness. She sobbed when she left her mother each morning, and when one day Clara refused her mother's demands to come to the studio with her, Sarah accused her of being ashamed of her own mother and thinking she was crazy, before falling into one of her catatonic spells. Clara felt terribly guilty, and her horror only increased as Sarah remained in a paralysed, glassy-eyed state for days. Clara was forced to go to work and leave her mother, and on New Year's Eve 1922, Sarah was brought back to the asylum and diagnosed as terminally insane. Robert Bow agreed to have her taken to another institution, the same one where Sarah's mother had died. Sarah herself passed away the day before she was to be transferred. Robert told Clara on the set, and many years later, still haunted by the memory, she sobbed, "I was dancing on a table with just a few clothes on when she left me for good." Clara retained her composure right up until her mother's coffin was lowered into the ground, at which point she tried to dive in after her and became hysterical. She wanted to give up acting, as she was sure it was what had killed her mother, but Robert, money always in mind, convinced her to continue. It was discovered that Sarah had epilepsy, specifically temporal lobe epilepsy, the symptoms of which correspond with the erratic and dangerous behaviour and her seizures. Epilepsy was considered shameful in those days, and Sarah's untreated condition, coupled with her family history of mental illness, sealed her fate. Mercifully, soon after her mother's death, Clara found comfort in first love with a cameraman called Arthur Jacobson, known as Artie. Clara met Artie when she got the main female role in Grit, a production by the Independent Film Guild Company. Grit's screenplay had been written by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Artie shot Clara's screen test. Every Saturday the couple would go on a date to a Chinese restaurant, before returning to Clara's home, where they would sit on the steps talking and kissing until dawn. The next day Artie would return to walk around Coney Island with Clara. In Grit, she once again impressed the director with her ability to cry at will. She stood out as one of the few highlights of the film when it was eventually released, after many cuts to please censors. F. Scott Fitzgerald himself hated it. It was on the set of Grit that Clara was discovered by Jack Bachman, who worked for an independent production company based in Hollywood called Preferred Pictures. After seeing her in Down to the Sea in Ships, Bachman had convinced his partner B.P. Schulberg to pay Clara $50 a week for a 3-month trial period in Hollywood. Clara was thrilled that someone was interested in her, and someone from California no less. After years of hoping and waiting for her fortunes to change, life suddenly began moving at an extraordinary pace. Within no time, Clara was given a blonde 20-something agent called Maxine Alton, who she looked up to as a kind of mother figure and mentor despite their close ages. Maxine's job was to take Clara to Los Angeles by a train leaving from Grand Central Station. Robert Bow was unable to come as he couldn't afford a ticket, and Maxine was surprised at his complete silence and lack of emotion when he came to see Clara leave. She left New York with only a few clothes, an old satchel, a portable phonograph, and a single record, but nevertheless, she had a naive determination that surprised Maxine. Clara was not impressed by the famous 20th century limited train they were travelling on, or by any of the scenery. Instead, she danced to the one record she owned until Maxine made her stop. Then Clara explored the train and got to know both guests and staff before the journey was even halfway completed. Clara's sole focus was on her future in Hollywood. Beneath the surface, anxieties must have played on her mind, as hundreds if not thousands of girls arrived in LA every year with the hopes of becoming a star, and very few succeeded. But Clara had miraculously come this far already, and she wasn't going to let self-doubt stop her now. Although she didn't seem overawed by travelling, the wider world would clearly take some getting used to. In the dining car, Clara had no idea what any of the items on the menu were, so she ordered one of everything, and when Maxine tried to explain using different utensils, such as a salad fork, for different courses, Clara thought she was joking. She also marvelled at how things could be sent by wire. When they arrived in Los Angeles, Maxine spotted journalists who she suspected had been sent by B.P. Schulberg waiting at the station. Clara's generally bedraggled appearance with her wild hair and shabby clothes would simply not do, so Maxine took her out the back entrance of the train and quickly telephoned Schulberg, who was annoyed when his reporters told him Clara had not got off the train. Maxine promised he would understand when he saw Clara. His first words upon seeing her were, "Is this a joke?" Clara maintained her composure as Maxine begged Schulberg to give her a screen test. By now, Clara was used to that kind of reaction. Schulberg directed her screen test himself, ordering her to act out a range of emotions from laughing to crying, all of which she performed effortlessly. Schulberg was so impressed he gave Clara the second lead in Preferred Pictures' latest movie, Maytime. Clara had been in Hollywood less than 2 hours and already had a job. At the time, 35 million people went to the movies every week. By the end of the decade it would be 90 million, and 4 out of every 5 films released internationally was made in Hollywood. The 1920s saw the still nascent film business become one of the fastest growing and most unpredictable industries. That innate unpredictability, coupled with the increasing number of major Hollywood scandals, had begun to worry the government. Women's groups and religious organizations were in favor of stronger censorship, which worried the Hollywood studios, and so they decided to preempt any official action by creating their own censorship board. The heads of all the biggest studios appointed Postmaster General William Hayes to oversee censorship, but he was stricter than they had imagined, resulting in the famous Hayes Code that would control Hollywood for over 2 decades, from 1934 to 1968. Although the Hayes Code would take a while to come into full swing, new rules were already introduced to Hollywood by the time Clara's star was rising, including the addition of a morals clause in all artists' contracts. The studio not only owned their time on the lot, but away from it too. If a star conducted themselves in a scandalous fashion, and that could have a broad meaning, the studio had a right to break the contract or even fine the offending artist. While the modern tendency is to view those calling for censorship as oppressive prudes, one has to look at the situation from the perspective of the older generations living through the 1920s. The difference between their own youth and the culture, attitudes and fashion of their children and grandchildren could not have been more different. In my opinion, there will never be a more shocking decade than the 20s, when you consider just how major the cultural shift from the 1900s and 1910s was. The daring attitudes of the era were reflected on screen, and could quickly spread even to the smallest of towns. In addition, the off-screen dramas in Hollywood provided more cause for concern. Wallace Reed, who was one of Clara's first celebrity crushes, was the first major star to have a drug-related death. A director had been murdered, and that had affected the careers of those around him, and of course the infamous Fatty Arbuckle case. The kind of scandals Hollywood was producing were unheard of in remote small-town America, where in some places the culture would still have been firmly of the 19th century. The idea of wild parties and thrilling romances were now replacing the tradition of marrying young and starting a family. Youth as we know it was invented in the 20s, and while that culture was not yet in full swing when Clara arrived in Hollywood, by the time she left, she had played an important part in creating it. Clara trusted her agent Maxine completely and believed her wholeheartedly when she was told she had to work harder to ensure she wasn't shipped back to Brooklyn. Clara also looked up to BP Schulberg and was constantly anxious he would fire her, as Maxine warned. When Schulberg gave her a beaded handbag for Christmas, Clara thought it was the best thing that had ever happened to her, but her naivety came to an abrupt end when she discovered Schulberg and Maxine being intimate. Clara demanded Maxine be fired and Robert Bow replace her. Clara's father was more than happy to call himself her business manager while not actually working at all. Artie Jacobson was so smitten with Clara, he moved from New York to California and lived with Clara and her father. After filming Maytime, Clara was loaned out to First National Studios for a novel adaptation called Black Oxen. Schulberg was receiving $500 a week to loan Clara, and she was paid $200. Loan-outs were a common practice for independent producers who didn't have a lot of projects for their actors, and sometimes it worked out being more lucrative to endlessly loan out stars. This time she was warmly received by the director, who upon seeing her said she was just what he was looking for. Her performance stood out to the critics, and First National extended her loan so she could appear in Painted People. Its star, Colleen Moore, was the original on-screen flapper who had introduced this new kind of woman to the public with her movie Flaming Youth, which had released the same year of 1923. Colleen was also married to the producer of Painted People. On her first day shooting a scene with Clara, the director wanted to get close-ups of Clara, but Colleen used her influence to stop him. In front of the cast and crew, Clara protested that Colleen was already a star and didn't need close-ups, but a newcomer like her needed everyone she could get. Clara couldn't understand why Colleen would want to sabotage her. In the more famous version of the story, which Colleen herself told, Clara lasted 2 days working on Painted People and quit after declaring to Colleen, "I don't like my part, I want to play yours." In reality, Clara went home and told Robert Bow and Artie all about Colleen's jealousy. Suddenly, Clara stormed out of the house, and when she came back hours later, her face was wrapped in bandages from a sinus surgery she had demanded the doctor perform then and there. Her sinuses had been giving her trouble, but her timing in having the issue fixed meant she would have to leave Painted People, and the production was put back 3 weeks behind schedule and way over budget. Colleen's protests over a single close-up had cost the production dearly, and Clara had her revenge. In late 1923, she was selected from 50 girls as the winner of Best Flapper Type, and only a few years later, the world wouldn't need a contest to know it. Despite receiving 5th billing, Clara's performance in Black Oxen earned her a place on the Wampas Baby Stars list of 1924. Every year, 13 newcomers with the most chance of achieving stardom were chosen by the Western Association of Motion Picture Advertisers and received as much press attention and buzz as an Oscar nominee today. The Wampas Frolic was held in their honour so they could be introduced to established stars, directors and producers. That year, due to a dancing curfew being placed in Los Angeles, the party was moved to San Francisco. Robert Bow was adamant he accompany his daughter, but he was too drunk to be let on the train. Clara went alone while all the other stars had parents, agents and publicists with them. When they arrived at the ball, she sat on the floor bewildered while the other baby stars networked. Those that spoke to her found her to be very sweet, but obviously sad and lonely. Clara had 8 movies released in 1924, none of which were exceptional, and one where her name was misspelt in the credits. She died at the beginning of another, and her male lead was a dog in Black Lightning, and he received higher billing than her. She starred alongside the first child star baby Peggy in Helen's Babies, and Peggy remembered Clara arriving on set with new hair almost every day. Every movie Clara made in 1924 was a loan-out, and each film required a different hairstyle and colour. She was a lucrative asset to B.P. Schulberg, and he had her schedule packed. She began to receive more attention in the press, and a columnist even came to her house for an interview. When the columnist was invited to stay for dinner, she observed in shock as Clara and her father got into a fight at the dinner table and threw macaroni at each other, some of which landed on the columnist. She was politely escorted out by Artie Jacobson, who often found himself helping Clara get out of trouble. One night, Clara was at a director's house, and when her father found out, he picked up his shotgun and drove to find her, promising to shoot the director even though the man wasn't doing anything untoward. Artie raced off in another car and managed to get Clara out of the director's home just before her father arrived. Artie and Clara also argued over her first pet, a large dog who she kept in one room of the house. She had the floor covered with dirt for the dog, but despite Artie's protests, refused to put her pet outside. Artie was exempt from Robert's usual possessive jealousy towards his daughter, but nonetheless, when they planned to marry, they did so in secret. They were on their way to elope when they had an argument and decided against it, but even after the end of their relationship, they remained close friends and would work together many times again. The first major story that made its way into the press about Clara wasn't about her at all, but rather her father's disastrously short-lived marriage. While buying a soda, he met a girl called Ella Mowry, who told him she was an orphan and aged 23. She was actually the same age as Clara, 18. They immediately got married, and Robert gave his age as 38 for the marriage certificate. He was actually 49. It's likely Robert introduced himself to Ella by boasting he was Clara Bow's father, something he made a habit of. He loitered on the sets of Clara's films, telling other young actresses he was Clara's father and offering them rides home in the car she had bought for him. Clara kicked Ella out of the house as soon as the newlyweds returned, and the marriage only lasted 5 days before Ella wanted a divorce. In that time, Robert had given her $1,000 to bring her family to California from New York. It turned out she wasn't an orphan after all. Within a month, they were in court where the judge pronounced Ella to be the most colossal gold digger I've ever heard of. Robert was still made to pay her $15 a month in alimony, which of course was actually paid by Clara. The press had a field day with the so-called kissless divorce. Ella said she was leaving Robert because every time she refused to kiss him, he spanked her. This humiliation cost Clara 6 weeks' salary, and yet her father could still do no wrong in her eyes. While filming a screen test in mid-1925, Clara spotted director Ernst Lubitsch smacking his lips and mistook his mannerism for mockery, so she smacked her lips right back at him. He called her a damned fresh kid, but decided to give her her best role yet in Kiss Me Again. Lubitsch was famed for the so-called Lubitsch touch, where his movies combined sophistication and elegance with a subtle sex appeal, making them a challenge to censor. Clara's standout performance and the film's overall success should have led to better parts, but Schulberg continued to put her in movies that barely lasted a day in theatres. These daily changes, as they were known, held Clara back professionally. Every time she had a hit, instead of following it up with strong material and thus keeping her career momentum, she was relegated to the same kind of work she'd been doing since her arrival in Hollywood. While giving Clara no room to grow professionally, the typical Preferred Pictures schedule was grueling. Filming began at 5 a.m. Monday, and the movie wrapped midnight Saturday, even if it needed more work. Clara filmed 16 movies in 18 months, and by 1925 she was underpaid, overworked, and still only a minor star. Although Schulberg loaned her out for $3,000 a week, she only received $750. Clara won the affection of every crew by working as hard as they did. She always arrived on time, and with her tomboy past, found it easy to relate to the working-class men who were reminiscent of her childhood friends. In the summer of 1925, Clara finally landed a role with potential. Schulberg had recently bought the rights to the best-selling novel The Plastic Age, written by a Dartmouth professor and based on the lives of his students. Clara plays Cynthia Day, a fun-loving flapper who gets into a love triangle with two college roommates. Gilbert Rowland was one of her two leading men, and he and Clara soon entered into a passionate romance. Gilbert had been born Luis Antonio de Maso de Alonso in Mexico, and had worked as an uncredited extra, but changed his name when he landed his first role in The Plastic Age. B.P. Schulberg's son, Bud, who had first met Clara when he was 10 and instantly took a liking to her, passed notes between Gilbert and Clara at the beginning of their romance. Bud was the only member of the Schulberg family who actually liked Clara. In the family, she was referred to in Yiddish as the crazy Gentile girl. B.P. Schulberg thought she was gullible and dumb, and his brother-in-law took lifelong pride in taking advantage of her emotionally needy state during their brief relationship. A possible reason Clara's talent was wasted in poor material for so long was her adamant refusal to sleep with B.P. Schulberg. He had a terrible reputation in the industry for his abuse of actresses, and while there were rumours Clara was one of his many affairs, those close to her recalled she took pride in never sleeping with him. She flirted with him as she did with everybody. It seemed to be her only way of communicating. The industry had placed a certain image on her, and Clara found it difficult to see where the flapper of the screen ended and her true personality began. She was clearly desperate for love and stability, but her mother had taught her to mistrust relationships and to hold power over men however she could. Her ideal man was strong and passionate, a source of guidance but never boring. Gilbert Rowland was her most thrilling boyfriend yet. Robert Bow hated him for being Mexican and a Catholic, but nevertheless the two soon became engaged. Gilbert called Clara Clarita and was passionately jealous over her, which she found to be exciting. Equally exciting was her career, which suddenly began to take off in a way even Schulberg couldn't ignore. Preferred Pictures was put on the map by the success of The Plastic Age, and Clara's performance stood out to audiences and critics alike. 7 years ago, Schulberg had been fired from his job as head of production at Paramount during a power struggle. He had started his own company as a result, and had not heard from Paramount's head Adolf Zucker since. After a string of deaths, scandals, and leading stars defecting to other studios, Paramount was sorely in need of new talent, and Adolf Zucker was eager to acquire Clara. He made Schulberg an irresistible offer of merging Preferred Pictures into Paramount while retaining creative control of Clara's films. Paramount owned 600 theatres and provided exponentially bigger budgets. Schulberg agreed to be an associate producer, and for Clara's first Paramount film, Dancing Mothers, the rights to the original play were bought for a larger sum than the budget of any of her previous movies. Clara returned to New York for the first time in 2 years for filming, and managed to make her character Kittens, who had been distinctly unlikable in the play, sympathetic and believable. Clara didn't just steal scenes, she stole the whole film. She was energetic and highly amusing without sacrificing depth. Audiences and critics proclaimed her a joy to watch, and upon her return to Hollywood, her newfound celebrity merited a cameo in Fascinating Youth, and she made another film called The Runaway before the studio gave her 6 weeks off while they searched for a worthy next project. They found it in Man Trap, where Clara's charisma shines as the incorrigibly flirtatious Alverna. Clara believed it was the best of her silent films. The film was directed by Victor Fleming, who would go on to direct The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind in the same year of 1939. Victor was one of the first people to truly recognise Clara's immense potential. He was immediately impressed by her natural ability, and his encouragement meant the world to her. Clara was 20 and Victor was 43 when they met, but despite the age gap and her engagement to Gilbert Rowland, she soon began a relationship with the director. He helped her navigate her growing fame and the sort of people it attracted, and acted as an almost paternal figure in her life. Victor was tall, handsome, and possessed a reserved masculinity that appealed to Clara, and like many women before and after her, she fell deeply in love with him. Clara rented a log cabin in West Canyon Drive after Man Trap wrapped, and at a party in Laurel Canyon met her first proper female friend, Tui Lorraine, a New Zealander from a circus background. A couple of days later, Clara and Tui were having a drink at Clara's cabin, when an incensed Gilbert Rowland stormed in declaring he wanted to fight a duel with Victor Fleming. Clara was delighted that she had inspired such jealousy, and convinced Gilbert she loved him, but soon a third man would enter the picture. Clara was introduced to Millionaire's son Robert Savage by mutual friends. After she kissed him at a party, he claimed she had kissed him so much his lips were sore for days, and his bragging made Clara dump him. His friends informed her that he might take his own life if she didn't go out with him, to which she responded that he wouldn't because he thinks too much of himself. After days of incessant begging, Clara finally allowed Robert to drive her home, but he tried to take her to get a marriage license instead. She protested, "I don't love you, I don't even like you," and thankfully they were 5 minutes too late for the license bureau. Clara demanded to be taken home and ignored all Robert's letters and calls after that. He went to her house but was told she was out by her father, so that very night, with a photo of Clara beside him, he cut his wrists just enough to bleed over the photo, but not enough to even knock him out, and by the time the police arrived he was smoking a cigarette. He was taken to a hospital and then his horrified parents moved him to a private sanatorium, but not before the headlines were filled with the scandal. Clara was forced to attend the sanity hearing, where Robert insisted he never meant to end his life, just get Clara's attention, and he boasted he would win her over yet. Clara called her own press conference, where she said that when men wanted to take their lives over love, they didn't do it with a safety razor but with pistols. Her wit avoided scandal and made the public love her even more. This case only added to the public and indeed Clara's own perception that her on-screen and real-life persona were one and the same. She tried to convince herself she was the Clara Bow of the movies, oozing self-confidence, light-hearted and independent, but she could never fully rid herself of the real, self-doubting, emotionally unstable girl behind the image. Her romances continued to provide a welcome distraction, and while Victor Fleming was indulgent of Clara's affairs, Gilbert Rowland broke off the engagement after the Robert Savage case. His resolve lasted all of a week before the couple reunited, and Clara promised Gilbert she would defy her father and elope to Mexico with him just as soon as her next film, Kid Boots, wrapped. Meanwhile, Paramount drew up an extension of Clara's Preferred Pictures contract with no alterations. Despite her growing popularity, she would only be paid $1,500 a week by 1928, a meagre amount when you consider one of Paramount's biggest stars, Gloria Swanson, had only just turned down the studio's offer of $1 million a year, the equivalent to roughly $17 million today, in favour of joining United Artists. Paramount hoped to groom Clara into their next big name, but they believed she was gullible enough to take whatever salary they gave her, and for the moment at least, she was. When Man Trap opened, reviews raved, "Clara Bow and how, what a man trap she is." They declared the movie should do for her career what Flaming Youth did for Colleen Moore's. Colleen's attempt to hold Clara back by denying her a close-up had done nothing, and now as the popularity of Colleen's flapper roles dwindled, Clara became the new quintessentially modern woman on screen, and her flapper roles were far more daring than Colleen's iteration had ever been. Clara's rise suddenly gained unstoppable momentum. Manhattan police were needed to control the crowds when Kid Boots opened around the same time as Man Trap. The Plastic Age had been working its way across the states and arrived in New York at the same time. For the first, but certainly not the last time in her career, Clara's biggest competition was herself. When her fans discovered she used henna to achieve her signature red hair, sales of it tripled, and her sharply defined heart-shaped lips sparked a lipstick trend. Clara was given a month to rest after Kid Boots, but the studio had ulterior motives. Clara was even more of a financial asset than they had realised, and they wanted to secure her in their power with a new extended contract. It was Victor Fleming who advised Clara to halt negotiations and hire a lawyer. Clara told Paramount she wouldn't sign a new contract until her current one had expired. Desperate, Paramount agreed to give Clara anything she wanted. They still believed her only business advisor was her father, and in the studio's eyes both father and daughter were equally stupid. To Paramount's horror, Clara arrived to sign the contract with Neil McCarthy, a skilled attorney. He negotiated until the studio agreed to pay Clara $5,000 a week by 1931, and put her in only 4 movies a year after 1927, in which she would be guaranteed star billing. She would have a custom wardrobe for every film and travel on train first class with her maid, and her father would be paid $100 a month to be her business manager. Finally, and most shockingly of all, she would be the only star at Paramount without a morals clause. Paramount agreed, but they created a loophole. Clara would receive a large bonus if her contract was not renewed after 1931, and the money was paid into a studio-controlled trust fund, but she would only receive the money if she didn't scandalise herself or Paramount. Unlike other stars, however, even if she did break this morals clause, she would still have her contract. Clara considered any money not in her hand to be money she didn't have at all, and she paid regrettably little attention to this loophole and signed the contract before leaving for San Antonio, Texas, to shoot her next film, a war epic called Wings, which became the first movie to win the Oscar for Best Picture. Most films took about a month to wrap. Wings took around 9, and the director only remembered that number because by the time the cast and crew left, many of the local girls were heavily pregnant. For those 9 months, everyone worked hard and arguably played even harder. Clara shot most of her scenes in Hollywood, but when she was on location, she visited Victor Fleming while he shot another movie nearby. The day after her arrival in San Antonio, she and Victor had announced their engagement, although she convinced Gilbert Rowland the press were making it all up. Clara loathed her modest wardrobe and infuriated the costume department by cutting the sleeves off, adding belts to show off her waist, and slashing slits in her costumes. Edith Head, who would one day be Hollywood's most famous costume designer, was just beginning her career at the time, and was assigned to manage Clara and make sure the costumes stayed as they had been made, which proved a difficult task. Nevertheless, Clara and Edith soon became good friends, and Clara got to show some skin after all. She caused a sensation in a scene where 2 soldiers walk in on her while she's undressing. 1927 was Clara's year. The first of her many hits to be released that year was It, where she played shopgirl Betty Lou Spence, who falls in love with her boss. After many misunderstandings, she wins him over with the sheer force of her It, a special sex appeal created by romance novelist turned screenwriter Eleanor Glynn. Glynn had scandalised Edwardian England with her sensual love stories, and at the dawn of the Roaring Twenties she was invited to Hollywood and gave the film colony her upper-class stamp of approval, for a price. She helped Hollywood develop many of its romance clichés, took Gloria Swanson under her wing, and held considerable sway for a time, all while thinking much of Hollywood was distinctly common. B.P. Schulberg read one of her stories and paid her $50,000 for adaptation credits, and to promote Clara as the It Girl. While the movie It bore little resemblance to Glynn's original novel, she proclaimed Clara had the most it of any actress, which nobody particularly cared about having until Clara had it. The first time Clara met Eleanor, the latter was lavishly dressed and swathed in veils to hide a recent facelift, and she took Clara's head in her hands while reeling off a list of celebrities who had it, including a horse. Eleanor didn't believe Clara actually had it until she saw her act, and thereafter devoted herself to singing Clara's praises. Eleanor and the director both agreed it was best to explain the basics of each scene and then let Clara do what she wanted with it, which resulted in one of Clara's best performances. She is brimming with energy and originality from start to finish. The cameramen found her hard to keep track of, and every time they lost her, a close-up would be used to cover their mistake. Clara was always eager to help other actresses, and even gave her co-stars tips on how to get their own close-up shots. Eleanor Glynn tried to get Clara to stop swearing and improve her manners, but after that short-lived project failed, Eleanor set off on a tour teaching the people of America how they too could have it. The film gave Clara unprecedented stardom and was the most popular movie by far in most cities, breaking attendance records. It showcases Clara's talent perfectly. She shocked the director by conveying 3 emotions in quick succession with her eyes. The first, an innocent look, the second, a look of desire, and then returning to innocence again. She did not let fame get to her head, however, and she continued to live with her father and moved into a 7-room new-build Spanish bungalow in Beverly Hills that cost her $15,000. Schulberg made her employ a cook and a driver, but Clara still preferred to drive herself when she wasn't going to and from the studio. While she remained humble and insecure as ever, her celebrity would begin to take its toll as she pushed herself to embody her characters in real life. Her love life was probably the area where she came closest to being the Clara Bow of the screen. While still engaged to both Gilbert Rowland and Victor Fleming, Clara began an affair with her gorgeous co-star Gary Cooper during the filming of Children of Divorce. Gary was so nervous the director mostly shot him from the waist up to hide his shaking legs, and after over 20 failed takes of a single scene, he was fired for all of a day before being rehired. This may have been due to Clara's influence, or that his replacement was even worse. Gary considered leaving acting for good, and Children of Divorce co-star Esther Ralston was tasked with cheering him up over lunch, where he confessed his love for Clara. The two had fallen in love while rehearsing, and Gary was nicknamed Clara's It Boy. Gilbert Rowland finally had enough and broke up with her. While he was quiet and reserved, Gary also possessed a jealous streak, and after a 6-month-long passionate affair, the couple broke up, probably due to Clara's relationship with Fleming and the disapproval of Gary's parents. They would, however, continue to casually reunite for the next 2 years. Clara did some of her finest acting in Children of Divorce, but the original draft of it was terrible, and so from 6 a.m. to midnight 6 days a week, Clara shot her other projects in the day and wore herself out with reshoots at night. Clara's next film, Rough House Rosie, was her most formulaic yet. Audiences didn't want to see Clara in movies with depth like Children of Divorce, and so the studio decided it was best if her films were cheap and her character closely resembled herself. Better still if Clara was by far the most famous member of the cast. Slowly this derivative material would seep away Clara's passion for acting, and without it, surviving 20-hour days on set would prove nearly impossible. Clara finally collapsed from exhaustion, although the press reported she had suffered a mental breakdown. She was given 3 months' rest, but the studio harassed her with bills for missing wardrobe items, and she even had to pay for photos of herself. During her holiday, she decorated her house in a vibrantly eclectic style. Clara's home was beautiful chaos. She had a made-to-order bed with a mirror in the canopy, and a whole room decorated in the Chinese style. Clara did everything just how she wanted to do it, and nowhere was that philosophy more present than her home, where the expensive and the tacky sat side by side. For a while she enjoyed roller skating on her driveway, until crowds of fans made that impossible. She financed her father's laundry business and skated to it with a bag of washing slung over her shoulder, but that venture ultimately failed, and Robert's next idea was opening a restaurant called It that boasted the official Clara Bow sandwich. Clara's cousin Billy lived with her when he came to California, and he worked at the restaurant before being caught selling alcohol and arrested. Clara told the press she wouldn't bail him out, but in the end she paid his fines and got him a job at Paramount. As for the restaurant, it closed down after less than a year in business. Victor Fleming directed Clara's next film, Hula, where she played the tomboy wild child of a Hawaiian planter who falls in love with a married Englishman. The New York Post called Hula one of the feeblest excuses for a motion picture ever out of Paramount Studios, but nevertheless Clara remained box office gold and Hula was a hit, likely because more skin was shown in the film than plot. The month of Hula's release, Wings was released with larger screens and sound effects to accompany the aerial battles. Clara was equally popular with men and women, and she drew a female audience to Wings, which played at one Broadway theatre for an astounding 63 weeks before moving to another theatre down the street. With her only competition still being herself, even the press began to notice Clara was worth way more than the $1,500 a week she was paid, especially as her films drew in a larger audience than stars paid $5,000 or $6,000. Consistently filling the movie theatres of the silent era was an achievement. These ornate buildings have all been torn down or converted into traditional theatres today. Theatres that could seat thousands of people often reported doing their best business when a Clara Bow film was showing. After the end of her engagement to Victor Fleming in late 1927, Clara was left lonely again. She stated that marriage and career were of equal importance to her, but soon the pressure of the industry would make her dream of leaving Hollywood and starting a family once her contract ended. She longed for better material, but audiences expected her to make a spectacle of herself in every film. Hollywood pushed a flirtatious and liberated image onto her and shunned her for living up to it. Being a sex symbol is a heavy load to carry when one is tired, hurt, and bewildered, Clara said. She turned up to lunch with the director wearing only a bathing suit. She told racy jokes at dinner parties and made no effort to conceal her past. She couldn't help but romanticize it, but even a sanitized version of her childhood was harrowing, and as Hollywood society tried to drag themselves up and away from their origins, Clara's candid interviews horrified her peers. When her friend Joan Crawford started dating Douglas Fairbanks Jr., the son of Douglas Fairbanks and the stepson of Mary Pickford, Joan dropped Clara from her social circle in order to fit in. Louise Brooks adored Clara and wanted to invite her to a dinner party, but her husband protested that Clara was too scandalous and unpredictable. Having only experienced the slums of Brooklyn and Hollywood, Clara was so unfamiliar with ordinary life she had to be told to stand up for the national anthem when she attended a football game for the first time in 1926. In late 1927, Clara went to a USC versus Berkeley game with her publicists. She wanted to see the USC Trojans, a team that was receiving a lot of attention at the time. When Clara saw the players, she said, "Where have these boys been all my life?" After the game, she called up the team's fraternity, who thought it was a prank call until Clara and Tui Lorraine arrived at the fraternity in Clara's car. Clara took two of the boys out for a drive, and so began a fun friendship. The team captain was a big fan of Clara, and soon the team regularly snuck out to attend parties at her house where other celebrities were often present. These gatherings were surprisingly innocent. The boys never drank, and Clara saw them as grown-up versions of her childhood playmates. She accidentally broke one player's thumb when he taught her how to tackle, and the police arrived at 4 a.m. after complaints about the loud music on another occasion. Robert Bow was usually out at a brothel, but when he came back one night to find a team of football players in his daughter's house, he was enraged and threw them all out. After that, Clara moved the parties to the Garden of Allah, formerly the home of Russian actress Alla Nazimova, that had been turned into a hotel. Clara's loud parties annoyed the other guests, and then she and the team would swim in a pool that was shaped like the Black Sea. Eventually, Robert Bow discovered his daughter's whereabouts and arrived when she was in a swimsuit surrounded by the football team. He screamed at her and dragged her away as she apologized to them. Her father deprived her of the only real friends she had. After that, Clara was just permitted to hold an annual dinner for the team at her house. In 1928, journalist Adela Rogers St. John was tasked by Photoplay with interviewing Clara. When she finally managed to locate her at the studio, Clara couldn't remember her home phone number and gave Adela the wrong address. Adela was waiting for Clara when the exhausted actress came home, but when she spoke about her life, she was shockingly candid. No star had revealed so much of themselves. Adela was so moved she convinced Photoplay to print Clara's words in the first person for an article series, and Adela made it her mission to have Clara accepted in Hollywood. Adela made her brother Clara's business manager and invited her to dinner parties, but as Clara said, "I'm a curiosity in Hollywood. I'm a big freak because I'm myself." Women didn't want Clara around their husbands. At Adela's home, Clara often watched others play tennis, and when one woman's husband silently sat 4 feet away from Clara, the wife became so enraged she smashed a tennis racket over his head. Clara adored Adela's 2 children. Her daughter Elaine said hugging Clara felt like hugging a kitten, and Adela's son Billy reminded Clara of her childhood friend Johnny. The children's governess loathed Clara because of her reputation, however, and the children were usually taken to their grandparents when Clara was around, much to the actress's disappointment. Adela eventually gave in to her own insecurities when she found Clara and her husband cooking together one night. It was likely Clara was awake because of her insomnia, but after that she was gradually pushed out of Adela's circle. Clara appeared in colour at the beginning of Red Hair, and while most of the film is lost, luckily the colour scene survives. After Red Hair, she was given a $10,000 bonus per film, which was put into her trust. She would only receive it in 1931 if she didn't scandalise herself or the studio first. Clara was finally given a serious film called Ladies of the Mob, and to get out of doing another comedy before it began shooting, she received a recommended appendectomy. At the time, Clara had 2 periods a month and suffered from regular stomach pains. The doctors advised both of her ovaries be removed, but she refused to give up her dream of having a family. Clara's hospital stay made national headlines, and she fell in love with a medical intern called William Earl Pearson while she was there. Pearson had originally flirted with Clara's friend Tui and had a wife back in Texas, but Clara reasoned he had no children and wanted to leave his wife anyway. Ladies of the Mob was not as successful as Clara's other films, and her fans complained they didn't want to see her in a serious role. To them she represented light-hearted fun and nothing more, and Clara was devoted to them. In 1 month she received 33,000 fan letters, and tried to read as many as she could. When a young boy wrote asking her if she could come down to Long Beach and help boost business at his popcorn stand so he could pay his parents' medical bills, she was there as soon as she had a free moment. Not all her experiences with fans were positive, however. Private detectives were hired to protect her after a series of stalkers and obsessive fans arrived at her house. Clara was beginning to lose her enthusiasm for work, and the long days were arduous. After the failure of Ladies of the Mob, the studio refused to give Clara serious material, or even good comedies. The critics pointed out she transcended her material and her talent was being wasted. Clara rented a Malibu beach house to stay in with friends in her free time. One day she took them to see a performance of Dracula starring the mysterious Bela Lugosi, a Hungarian actor who couldn't speak a word of English and learned his lines phonetically. Clara was so impressed by the performance, she invited him back to her house. Clara's best friend, Tui Lorraine, noticed that Clara signed blank checks to her staff, and Tui discovered they were overcharging Clara on groceries and bills so they could keep half of the money. Clara fired her maid and cook, and they got their revenge on Tui by trying to have her deported, as she had come into the country illegally. They also accused her of carrying STDs, and Tui spent a miserable weekend in jail. To save herself from deportation, Tui declared she was engaged to Robert Bow. They married in September of 1928, and Clara was overjoyed, despite the fact her new stepmother was younger than her. Tui was miserable, however. Not only did she loathe her new husband, but she was secretly in love with Clara, who was absolutely oblivious and saw Tui as a sister. Robert Bow was also jealous of the close relationship between his wife and daughter. When Tui caught Robert cheating, she filed for divorce, and Clara felt betrayed. In her naivety, Clara saw this strange marriage as a second chance at family. After the divorce, Tui arrived drunk at Clara's house to plead for their friendship, but Clara remained loyal to her father, and the former best friends never saw each other again. Soon Clara was involved in another divorce when William Earl Pearson's wife Elizabeth arrived in Los Angeles and discovered her husband's affair with America's biggest star. She cited Clara in the divorce and sued her for $150,000. The studio were desperate to keep the case out of the press and used Clara's trust fund to pay Mrs. Pearson off, which with Clara's bonuses amounted to $56,000. Clara was furious and surprisingly couldn't afford to lose that kind of money, although she never considered it to be hers to begin with, and ignored the morals clause attached to it. Her staff still took advantage of her kindness. Her house was filthy because her maids never bothered to clean. Termites had infested the beams, and one nearly fell on Clara. Her business manager, the brother of Adela Rogers St. John, had never made her mortgage payments, so although a few weeks of her salary could have bought her house outright, instead she was about to go into foreclosure. After Tui Lorraine's departure, Clara found a new best friend in her on-set hairdresser, a smart and independent woman called Daisy DeVoe. Paramount knew Clara's life was beyond her own control, and so Daisy was appointed as Clara's assistant, and was horrified to discover the state of the star's affairs. Clara had by far usurped Colleen Moore as the most popular film flapper, and yet Clara earned $2,800 a week, while Colleen was paid $125,000 per movie. When Daisy DeVoe took control of Clara's finances, she had only $16,000 in the bank, and so Daisy established a savings account and gave Clara a weekly allowance. Daisy also kicked Robert Bow and Clara's cousin Billy out of her house, and put a stop to the house parties where Clara would allow strangers to attend. For the first time, Clara's life was organised, but then a new crisis struck: the talkies. At first, speaking in films was seen as a passing fad, but it quickly became clear that even the most established stars' careers were under threat if their voices didn't record well. The success of The Jazz Singer in 1927 began Hollywood's progression out of the silent era, but it wasn't until 1929 that the change truly gained momentum. If stars with smooth and clear voices recorded horribly, what chance did Clara have with her Brooklyn accent? There were rumours that recordings could be modified, so even a good voice might be sabotaged. Stage actors who had previously derided the movies as a lesser profession now flocked to Hollywood to try their luck. Overnight, a whole new industry sprung up, with theatre performers teaching terrified celebrities how to improve their voices. Talking normally wasn't enough. The primitive technology of the early sound films meant every word was an effort and speaking became a science. To make matters worse, all the freedom of the silent films was gone. Sets had once been filled with activity and sound. Crews chatted and actors could have conversations even while filming. In Clara's case, in a scene where she was supposed to be angry at her scene partner, she was actually offering him words of encouragement. Now a nervous hush fell over the set for every scene. The camera could no longer move freely, and artistic filmmaking was set back with the necessity of accommodating a microphone. Actors walked carefully so their footsteps wouldn't be heard, and they worked under unbearably hot lights that didn't make any noise. For Clara's voice test, she was given the privilege of being filmed as well as recorded. Her voice wasn't as bad as she thought it was, but she still screamed in horror when she heard it. While other actors took time off to prepare for their sound debut, Clara was given 2 weeks from her sound test to the filming of The Wild Party. Not only was she still doing formula films, now she had over 100 pages of script to deal with. The crew tried to ease her mind by carefully mapping out each scene and concealing the microphone when possible, but when it loomed above her, Clara couldn't help looking up at it in terror, which ruined countless takes. Considering her paralysing anxiety, Clara performed surprisingly well in The Wild Party, which was a success. Critics said her voice suited her personality, and Clara received a record number of 45,000 fan letters in January of 1929. She was spared a full press tour and instead returned to Brooklyn for the first time since achieving fame. Huge crowds ignored the cold and waited hours just to catch a glimpse of her, and when she spoke at the movie theatre, the crowd cheered passionately. Clara was deeply moved. Clara's next film, Dangerous Curves, was supervised by Ernst Lubitsch, who had a number of changes made to suit her. Her Brooklyn accent fit her character, and both she and the audience enjoyed it. However, Paramount quickly pulled it from distribution before it could become a hit. The frustrating mismanagement of Clara's career is as obvious now as it was then. With the art of film evolving, critics felt Clara should and could evolve with it. Audiences were slowly beginning to tire of the it girl she played in almost every film, and yet Paramount stubbornly refused to give her range, even when it worked against their own best interests. Clara's next boyfriend was egotistical entertainer Harry Richman. Putting on the Ritz was written about him and became his theme song, and gangster Al Capone gave him safety for life after watching a performance. Richman was already a successful singer, actor and comedian in New York, where he owned the popular Club Richman, but he wanted even more fame on the silver screen. He was 10 years Clara's senior and originally dated her for the publicity, but claimed he fell in love after the first date. For a while, Clara enjoyed the highly publicised relationship, and Harry's career was given a massive boost. People only invited him to events because Clara Bow was sure to attend alongside him. When they went to Coney Island, huge crowds gathered, and Harry lavished Clara with gifts, such as a large dog she named Duke. However, Clara quickly tired of Harry's antics. He would act surprised when the press swarmed them getting off a train, when he had actually notified the reporters, and Harry was constantly pressuring Clara to marry him. She accepted the $5,000 engagement ring he gave her, but refused to set a date for the wedding. During a trip to New York, Clara took Daisy DeVoe to visit an asylum where Clara paid for her aunts, her mother's two sisters, to live. They didn't recognise her, nor did they speak, and Clara left dejected. Her next film, The Saturday Night Kid, showed just how much Clara was valued by Paramount. It was a remake of a 1926 film directed by Louise Brooks's husband Edward Sutherland, who had shunned Clara, and Jean Arthur got the best part. Unlike most stars, Clara didn't resent this and encouraged Jean, although a rare moment of jealousy did occur between Clara and another Jean. After spotting a young Jean Harlow who had a small part in the film, Clara ordered her to be fired. But when she wasn't, Clara overcame her insecurities and befriended Harlow, even posing for photos with her. By late 1929, Clara was almost at breaking point and was hospitalised to have one ovary removed. Despite loathing talkies, for the second year in a row, Clara was named the top box office draw, and when she visited relatives in Brooklyn, people climbed trees just to catch a glimpse of her, and she needed a police escort to take her back to Manhattan. Richmond was heavily pressuring her into matrimony, and she finally called a press conference to announce she wouldn't be marrying him because she was expecting a nervous breakdown soon and wanted to return to California to deal with it. Paramount did nothing to help her, and instead insisted she sing a song called True to the Navy for Paramount on Parade, a movie showcase of the studio's talent. Clara was terrified of singing, and when a fire broke out at Paramount, she was overheard muttering, "I hope it's the soundstage." Despite these huge setbacks, Clara's song was so popular, the studio expanded it into a movie of the same name, where Clara would work with her future husband, Rex Bell. Born George Francis Bedlam in Chicago in 1903, his family moved to California when he was a child, and Rex grew up loving horses and dreaming of owning his own ranch. He worked as a truck driver and was discovered while making a delivery to Fox Studios, and his name was eventually changed to Rex Bell. He saw films as just another job, and was happy to leave them if his career didn't work out. Rex was the perfect gentleman and had seemingly endless patience with Clara, who he said was his first real love. Finally, she had found a man who understood her. He was even willing to overlook her infidelities, as long as she was always honest. And Robert Bow's hatred didn't faze Rex either. Clara's love life was finally peaceful, but then she discovered that William Earl Pearson's wife had never accepted the money from Clara's trust, nor had it been returned to Clara, and so, without the knowledge of Paramount, she and Daisy DeVoe took a trip to Texas to investigate where the money had gone. Clara went to the Pearsons' house, where William's heavily pregnant wife Elizabeth refused to speak to her. Clara was seen with William before giving a disastrous interview to the press. Soon the affair Paramount had worked so hard to conceal was front-page news across the country, and Clara still had no idea where her money was. Unbeknownst to her, William had accepted it. Clara was the object of derision and mockery as the other woman. Even her fans agreed she had gone too far. To make the best of the scandal, Clara's next movie was a racy comedy called Her Wedding Night. Clara felt humiliated and was beginning to fear public appearances. She announced her intentions to leave the industry once her contract ended in favour of starting a family. Rex remained devoted to her, and when he was filming on location in Nevada, Clara and Daisy drove down to see him. Clara enjoyed gambling and went to a casino where she mistook $100 chips for 50-cent ones. Daisy DeVoe arrived just as Clara was arguing that she only owed $69.50, not the $13,900 the casino claimed she had lost. Daisy was horrified and quickly wrote a check. She drove Clara all the way home before rushing to the bank to cancel it. Soon men from the casino started arriving at Clara's home, threatening extreme violence if she didn't pay. Schulberg had the men arrested, which only provoked the casino owner to make the case public. Clara's refusal to pay her debts made her look even worse in the public's eyes than having an affair with a married man. As usual, the studio only cared about profits, and Clara's next film, No Limit, even made a cheap reference to the scandal. She went to New York to film and was disturbed by the crowds of people that came to see her. Harry Richman was still trying to salvage their relationship, but she officially broke up with him upon her return to Hollywood. Clara found it increasingly difficult to say her lines or even make sense of them. Any unfamiliar word could send her into hysterics, such as the wedding vows in No Limit. The day the wedding scene was being shot, Al Capone turned up to the set. He was a big fan of Clara and cheered with the cast and crew when she finally got through the scene. Through all her struggles, Rex remained devoted to Clara, but Daisy DeVoe refused to believe he was genuine, and the mistrust was mutual. Both believed the other was only using Clara. When Rex talked about making investments, Daisy went to the bank and had them take away Clara's ability to sign checks. When Daisy overheard Rex talking about firing her, she took all Clara's important documents, checkbook, and even her personal correspondence, and put them in a safety deposit box. When Rex found out, he convinced Clara that Daisy had stolen from her, and Daisy was fired and thrown out of Clara's house. Under Daisy's careful management, Clara's savings had increased from $16,000 to almost $250,000 in around 2 years, and now that Clara had turned against her, Daisy felt entitled to half of the money. If Clara wanted her possessions back, including the private correspondence, she would have to pay Daisy $125,000. Daisy's attempt to blackmail the woman who had been her closest friend only days before made any hope of reconciliation unthinkable. Daisy realised this too late when she went to Clara the next day begging to simply have her job back. When Rex tried to throw her out, Daisy immediately resorted to more blackmail, saying she would give the press Clara's personal correspondence, where the overlapping dates of love letters showed Clara's unfaithfulness and promiscuity. Rex called the police and the case was given top priority by Paramount's lawyer. Rex and Clara were able to retrieve the contents of Daisy's safety deposit box, where she also stored the many expensive gifts that had been bought with Clara's money, although the star never remembered purchasing them. In truth, Clara's taste was famously tacky, so whenever she wanted to give Daisy or anyone else a gift, Daisy would choose it. The presents were collectively worth $35,000, and in light of the stolen documents and blackmail, Daisy was arrested and interrogated for 27 hours before being thrown in jail and illegally denied the right to call a lawyer. Clara refused to drop the lawsuit, so Daisy filed one of her own for false arrest. She demanded her things be returned and $5,000 in damages. Paramount's lawyer responded by calling a grand jury and indicting Daisy on 37 counts of grand theft, which could earn her a maximum sentence of 375 years in prison. Each case was punishable by 1 to 10 years. In a matter of weeks, a simple misunderstanding had spiraled into Clara's most disastrous scandal yet. It was within Schulberg's power to end the case before it even began, but instead he allowed it to proceed, knowing it would be Clara's ruin. The allegations against Daisy looked bad, and she reasoned if she was going down, she would drag Clara down with her. When the trial began on January 13th, 1931, the courtroom was full to bursting and the corridors were packed. Elegantly dressed and calmly poised, Daisy revealed damning details of Clara's life, many of which were complete lies. Daisy claimed Clara had threatened her life before, and was drunk when Daisy stole Clara's documents. She revealed the overlapping dates on love letters, and all-night poker games the star participated in. The public believed it all, even the most blatant lie that Clara retained evidence of her father's spending in order to blackmail him, even though Clara's fans knew she was devoted to Robert. If Clara had maintained equal composure to Daisy when she took the stand, she might have been able to defend herself, but instead she clung to Rex and visibly shook with nerves. Her stutter, high-pitched Brooklyn accent and use of slang didn't help her case. The courtroom laughed at every word, and eventually Clara broke down and sobbed that Daisy had been her best friend in the whole world. This is even more heartbreaking when you consider that Daisy's claims had been lies, but Clara could have defended herself with the truth. Clara knew Daisy's father was in prison for bootlegging, and Daisy was currently conducting an affair with a Chinese cameraman called James Wong Hao, but Clara said nothing and never appeared in court again. Daisy was acquitted of all but one count of theft, for which she received 18 months. She screamed, then fainted when the sentence was read. Clara, meanwhile, was suffering a complete breakdown and ordered to rest. Her latest film, No Limit, was not only a major flop, but coincided with all Clara's films being banned in certain areas of California and Texas. With the Great Depression gaining momentum, attitudes towards excess and frivolity changed almost overnight, and the wild behaviour that made Clara the darling of the 20s now made her the pariah of the early 30s. The studio had finally given her the film that could save her career, City Streets. Complete with a skilled director and writers, Clara was set to star alongside Gary Cooper, but her breakdown made her unable to work, and she was utterly crushed when she was replaced by Schulberg's latest protégé and mistress, Sylvia Sidney. Clara's inability to speak on camera resulted in her essentially being relegated to a supporting role on her next film. Nevertheless, after multiple takes of one scene where Clara couldn't stop her eyes from drifting upwards towards the microphone, she snapped and started punching it until her fists bled, while screaming hysterically and swearing. Then Clara ran off to her Malibu cottage, where Artie Jacobson followed her and held her while she sobbed as they waited for a doctor. Clara told Artie, "This ain't no life, the fun's all gone." The final straw came a week later when the Coast Reporter began an expose it claimed came from the lips of Daisy DeVoe. Among many things, Clara was accused of drunken revelry and drug addiction, of having carnal relations with relatives and her dog, and carrying STDs. The paper encouraged Paramount to fire her, and the final consensus of these articles was that it would have been better if Clara Bow had succeeded in ending her teenage daughter's life 10 years ago. The publisher, Frederick Gurnau, tried to get Clara to buy the paper for $25,000, and when that failed, he mailed copies of the story to Will Hayes, thus breaking the law by sending obscene material by post. Gurnau was arrested and sentenced to 8 years in jail. Clara vomited in her dressing room when she read the articles. When she was unable to come into work, Schulberg told her to snap out of it and cooperate with us. After that harsh telegram, Clara responded with a heartbreaking yet gracious letter Schulberg never bothered to respond to. "I have found that nothing else except happiness and health count in this life," Clara said. "I have never had much of either, but I'm going to find them both." Instead of being allowed the rest she sorely needed, the studio pressured her into an immediate return. She managed to get through a fitting and rehearsal with the director at her home, but that night her housekeeper was awoken by Clara screaming, "I can't do it, I can't do it." Rex was called and he drove Clara to the Glendale Sanitarium, where she was diagnosed with shattered nerves and ordered to completely rest. With her last few films performing terribly, Paramount decided they wanted to get rid of Clara after all, but they knew if they ended her contract now, they would have to pay her $60,000, the equivalent of roughly $900,000 today. The studio promised to release Clara immediately and tricked her into agreeing to end the contract with no settlement, after which Schulberg finally wrote her a sympathetic letter. When Clara came to the studio to pack up her dressing room, however, she found it had already been given to Sylvia Sidney, and hardly anyone was there to wish her goodbye. The next week, Rex invited Clara's loyal friends to her house for a dinner, where he announced it was the last time they would see her, as he was taking her far away from Hollywood to save her life. Clara had arrived in Hollywood a decade before, with a personality as vibrant as her red hair, and a seemingly endless enthusiasm for life. Now, having made movie history, she left Hollywood as an exhausted blonde on the edge of collapse. She had dyed her hair to avoid being recognised as she stepped into her uncertain new life. She was only 25 years old. In the middle of 300,000 acres of desert between California and Nevada stood a small house known as the Shack. Without electricity, kerosene lamps were relied upon for lighting, and in place of modern plumbing there was an outhouse. The nearest neighbours were 35 miles away, and the local town had only 130 residents, and no movie theatre. This was to be Clara's new home, and she loved it. With the certainty of following the same daily routine, Clara felt happy and free for the first time in her life. Rex refused to marry her until he could afford to support her with his own money, and Clara helped where she could to manage the ranch and its 1,200 cattle. Clara put on 25 pounds in a single month and adjusted to her new life with surprising speed. Rex taught her to shoot and she became skilled at it. Every morning she hiked with her dogs, Duke and a spaniel named Diablo that she had found by the side of the road. Her love for animals caused her to become a vegetarian for a single day after her favourite calf was slaughtered, but her resolve broke when she smelled dinner that night. When she and Rex ventured into town, Clara often played baseball with the local children and was warmly received by the community, who had never seen her movies and only knew her as Rex Bell's girlfriend. Her favourite part of the day was riding out to watch the sunset with him. Clara's sole reminder of her old life came from the many fan letters that were forwarded to her. She was surprised the public opinion had changed, and her fans were full of praise and sympathy once again. They wished her well, and some told her they had stopped going to the movies when she stopped making them. After Rex was offered a film role, the couple moved to Las Vegas, which at the time was an ordinary town. They married there on December 3rd, 1931, and the first international call Las Vegas received came from foreign newspapers inquiring if it was true Clara Bow was married. The publicity prompted Clara to consider returning to movies, but strictly on her own terms. After receiving many offers, she chose to sign a 2-film deal with Fox Studios, for which she would be paid $250,000 and have the right to approve the script, cast, and director. She starred alongside her old flame Gilbert Roland in Call Her Savage, which was adapted from a best-selling novel.
Here comes your father.
Oh, I don't like him.
Your own father?
What's that got to do with it? If I don't like him, I don't like him, that's all.
It had enough plot for 3 movies, but Clara was finally able to play a complex, mature woman. She transcended the film's melodrama with a charismatic and moving performance.
Why am I like this? I hate to get angry, but I just can't help it. Why can't I be like other girls?
I'm speaking to you, young woman. Why were you whipping him?
I was practicing in case I ever get married.
Clara's comeback was such a hit that box offices closed early after selling out of tickets. Meanwhile, business had never been worse for Paramount, as they went into receivership. Schulberg owed his career at Paramount to Clara, and without her his life fell apart within a year of her retirement. He had left his wife for Sylvia Sidney, and Paramount placed the blame for their downfall on him, so Schulberg was fired. Instead of gloating as one might expect, Clara was sympathetic and shared a bottle of wine with him at his house. As Fox searched for her second film, they sent Clara on a 2-month European press tour that served as a honeymoon for her and Rex. They sailed to England, then to France, Germany and Switzerland. Clara preferred the relaxed culture of Europe and found that the people were less demanding there and kept to themselves. Aside from New York and California, Clara had rarely travelled and enjoyed sightseeing and skiing in Europe. When the couple returned to Hollywood, they stayed with producer Louis Lewin, and Clara became good friends with his wife Marion. After a year of waiting for a second film, Clara was eager to end her contract and agreed to make Hoopla, where she played a seductive dancer. It was a return to weaker material, but became a success, and critics promised Clara a long career ahead of her if she continued to act, but she was ready to leave the industry for good and start a family. Clara and Rex returned to the ranch, where a 2-story house with all the modern amenities was built. It was named Rancho Clarita and even boasted a billiards room, as well as a large living room and running water which was pumped across miles of desert. Soon a house was rented in LA, however, so Clara could be closer to her doctor and a hospital, as she was pregnant. When she gave birth to Rex Jr., who was nicknamed Tony, her father refused to visit the hospital. Robert Bow loathed his daughter's husband so much he couldn't stand the grandchild that resembled Rex Bell. Clara had gained weight during her pregnancy and was 200 pounds. The housewives she became friends with were surprised at how ordinary she was compared to her on-screen persona. After miscarrying a second pregnancy at 2 months, Rex encouraged the devastated Clara to distract herself with a new project, and she opened the It Cafe on Hollywood Boulevard and Vine Street in September of 1937. She hoped to be a constant presence there, but 2 weeks after the opening she took to her bed with a second pregnancy that doctors warned would be her last, and the cafe closed soon after. Clara hoped for a daughter, but instead gave birth to another boy called George, who resembled the Bow side of the family, and for that reason was accepted by Robert Bow. The family moved back to Rancho Clarita, where Clara focused on becoming the perfect housewife. She only disciplined her sons when necessary, and was completely devoted to them. Unlike her own parents, she accepted their personalities and only punished genuine disobedience. Nevertheless, Clara struggled with motherhood and marriage immensely. She was still plagued by insomnia and relied on pills to fall asleep. She expected Rex to stay up with her into the early hours of the morning, and was offended when he wanted her to keep the same hours as the family, instead of waking up after midday. Rex had become a pillar of the community, and after so many years of patience with Clara, her behaviour appeared selfish to him. Rex was hard-working, responsible and sociable, and these qualities earned him a promotion to District Director of the National Grazing Committee. When he began to travel regularly, often staying away for a night or two, Clara was furious. He was not being unfaithful to her, but it was the lack of constant attention and validation that Clara couldn't stand, and after one trip, she shot his tyres out in anger. Clara had developed an aversion to seeing almost anyone outside her family, but she resented Rex socialising without her. Every time he left, she saw it as an abandonment, similar to how her father had abandoned Clara Bow. Soon Clara complained of so many illnesses she was unable to leave her bed, although doctors maintained there was nothing physically wrong with her. In late 1939, she was taken to a clinic in Minnesota where a personality disorder was diagnosed. Clara refused to believe her problems were psychological, but agreed to a 4-month stay in a Los Angeles sanitarium. When she returned to the ranch, she brought her father with her, who now insisted on being called King Bow. Clara's health improved now she had her father's company, but he terrorised her eldest son Tony, and would strike the boy for no reason. However, Robert Bow adored the second son, George. Rex was too busy to see the growing problems in his family. He now owned 600,000 acres of land and was the leader of the local Republican Party. Whatever he did to try and make Clara happy usually had the opposite effect. She had now taken 2 years off her age, and in 1942 Rex threw her a large 35th birthday party for what was actually her 37th birthday. Clara saw this party as another sign of how little Rex understood her, and her feelings of betrayal only grew when he ran for Congress the following year. Clara lashed out and belittled her husband the way her own mother had sneered at Robert Bow's ambitions. But instead of fighting back, Rex tried to ignore Clara's anger, which was now even being directed at her children. One night, Rex's mother came to dinner, and Clara asked her son Tony if he liked her father or his paternal grandmother better. Robert Bow was abusive towards Tony, and so he said he preferred his grandmother, and Clara slapped him so hard he fell onto the floor crying. Rex was concerned by this out-of-character violence, and one day Clara's children found her unconscious and surrounded by pill bottles while he was away. The boys managed to get help in time, and Clara only survived the barbiturate overdose because of her high tolerance to them. She had attempted to end her own life because she said death was preferable to the public life she would be forced to endure if Rex was elected to Congress. He was devastated and lost the election. Clara's mental problems could no longer be ignored, and Rex sent the boys to live with his parents for the next 18 months. Clara had grown to hate the remote ranch, but fared little better when the family moved to Las Vegas. She barely left the house while Rex occupied himself with a successful Western clothing store that even had celebrity customers. Rex would not permit Robert Bow to live with the family, but he walked from his nearby house to see Clara every day. His abuse of Tony continued until the boy hit back, and Clara fetched them both boxing gloves to settle things. 12-year-old Tony beat 72-year-old Robert, and the old man never hit Tony again. Clara not only ventured out of the house, but appeared in an 11-week radio show to raise money for polio research in 1947. She was known as Mrs. Hush, and the listeners had to guess who the mystery celebrity was. Clara raised $550,000, but still suffered from mic fright and was wary of the publicity the radio show brought her. The papers reported she was a happy housewife, but in reality her condition was deteriorating even further. Rex and Clara both agreed on her staying at the Institute of Living in Connecticut to improve her psychological state. She was given a regular diet and exercise plan, but spent all her free time in her room, painting, writing and studying. To her surprise, she scored well on an IQ test, but it was also discovered she had absolutely no ability to reason. That, coupled with her other symptoms, made her an obvious diagnosis of schizophrenia. Far from helping her heal, the pressures and responsibilities of family life had been too much for Clara's sensitive mind. She had only managed to keep going for so long in the industry because she clung to the image Hollywood gave her. Without a public persona, she felt as though she didn't exist. She had an inability to learn from her past mistakes or understand social rules. Clara received electroshock therapy and worked through her issues in speaking sessions, where memories she had repressed for decades came rushing back. She remembered her father's violation of her body while her mother was in the asylum, and she remembered her mother locking her in a closet as a child when Sarah sold her own body. Even after these dreadful revelations, Clara made the same excuses that her parents had only abused her out of love. In the end, it was too late to repair the damage to her psyche. Clara still insisted the majority of her ailments were physical, and she was discharged from the institution after 10 months there. She was eager to return to her family, even her father, but Rex wouldn't allow her to come home, seeing little point in attempting family life when it had already failed so many times. Clara felt betrayed and abandoned, but her move to LA was ultimately better for her. While Rex remained in Las Vegas and Rancho Clarita was sold, Clara enjoyed a reclusive and relaxed lifestyle. She had regular therapy sessions with Dr. Carl von Hagen, who also treated Doris Day. Clara went swimming, painted and read as many as a dozen books a week, most of which were large volumes of non-fiction. She also stayed up to date with the news and had opinions on just about everything. After a few moves, Clara settled into a bungalow in Culver City with a live-in nurse who kept her fans at bay when she experienced a pop culture revival. To Clara's surprise, she gained a whole younger generation of fans when some of her talkies were televised, and she was ranked second after Greta Garbo in a list of the greatest artists of the 1920s. Her Japanese neighbours pretended not to speak English when her fans knocked on their doors looking for Clara, and her nurse always answered when they did find her. She signed pictures for them but never appeared herself. Clara loved going Christmas shopping and corresponding with her friends. She also enjoyed drive-ins and adored Marilyn Monroe. She admired Marlon Brando so much she invited him to her house, and he gladly signed a photograph for her, as he was equally a fan of her. Clara's sons saw such an improvement in her, they wondered if she'd been misdiagnosed and only needed rest. Tony was overjoyed when she came to a football game at his military academy. Now that she wasn't expected to be a part of it, Clara passionately supported Rex's political career. He was immensely popular and became Lieutenant Governor of Nevada in 1955. She was less supportive of his relationship with a woman named Katie Jenkins. Rex wouldn't put Clara through a divorce, but he knew their marriage was over. On the 4th of July 1962, Rex died from a heart attack and Clara was devastated. She made a rare public appearance for his funeral and became even more reclusive after his death. Clara was left nothing in Rex's will, which was divided between Katie and his sons. He did not do this out of spite. Clara had more than double his fortune and didn't need the money. Nevertheless, she was hurt. Exactly a month to the day after Rex's passing, Marilyn Monroe died, and Clara was deeply grieved. She had felt protective of Monroe, seeing so many similarities between them, and Clara said she passed on her crown of it girl to Marilyn. In her last years, Clara was visited by Harry Richman until he revealed his plans to include her in a tell-all biopic about his life. Gilbert Roland visited and wrote regularly and remained Clara's favourite actor. On Sunday, September 26, 1965, Clara passed away peacefully while watching a movie called The Virginian, which starred her old flame Gary Cooper. Sadly, despite renewed public interest, Paramount made no effort to preserve Clara's films, many of which literally turned to dust in the studio's archives and are now lost. But there is always the hope that a forgotten print will be rediscovered, as the movie It was in the 1960s. The lack of availability of Clara's films meant that for many years her remarkable career was overshadowed by rumours and blatant lies. In explorations of silent film history, she is often noticeably absent. Louise Brooks complained vehemently about this, and now it is beginning to change as Clara's artistry is recognised at last. Finally, a century after her stardom, Clara Bow is now being viewed in the light she always deserved to shine in. Thank you for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed this video and subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Please comment any suggestions for future topics. Until next time.